Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. Imagine spending 60 grand to build a totally legal storm shelter, hidden behind a bookshelf. And your HOA president decides you're running an underground compound. He slaps you with fines, demands an inspection, then shows up with cops and the fire marshal. But the real surprise that day? It wasn't in my basement. It was in his backyard. Let me start by saying I never wanted any drama with my neighbors. I moved into this community about 8 months ago specifically because it seemed like a place where people minded their own business and took care of their properties. The houses were well maintained, the streets were clean, and honestly, the HOA fees seemed reasonable for what you got. Boy, was I wrong about that last part. I work as a senior logistics coordinator for a major distribution company. My job involves planning for every possible scenario that could disrupt supply chains. When COVID hit and I watched people fighting over toilet paper, I realized most folks have no idea how fragile our everyday systems really are. That got me thinking seriously about what my family would do if something really went wrong. I'm not talking about zombies or nuclear war or any of that nonsense you see in movies. I mean realistic stuff like extended power outages, water contamination, severe weather events, or supply chain disruptions lasting weeks instead of days. Living through a few major hurricanes when I was younger taught me that being prepared isn't paranoia, it's just smart planning. So when I bought this house, one of the first things I looked into was adding a storm shelter. Not just some basic safe room, but a proper multi-purpose space that could serve as emergency storage and a backup power center. I spent 3 months researching building codes, getting soil surveys done, and working with architects to design something that would be both functional and completely legal. The paperwork alone cost me almost $2,000. I got structural engineering reports, environmental impact assessments, utility clearance certificates, and permits from 3 different county departments. Every single form was filled out in triplicate, every signature was notarized, and every inspection was scheduled months in advance. I even hired a contractor who specializes in government compliance work because I wanted zero chance of any issues down the road. The construction took 4 months. We dug down 8 feet below the existing basement floor, installed reinforced concrete walls rated for F4 tornado winds, and put in a ventilation system that meets both residential and commercial building codes. The entry is through a steel door that looks like it belongs in a bank vault, but it's completely hidden behind a bookshelf in my basement office. Above ground, the only visible signs are a couple of air intake vents disguised as decorative planters and a small concrete pad where the emergency exit comes up near my back fence. Everything was designed to blend in perfectly with the landscaping. The contractor even matched the brick and stonework to the existing house so well that you'd never know anything was added. I spent another $15,000 on supplies. Water filtration systems, long-term food storage, medical supplies, backup communications equipment, and a generator system that could keep the house running for weeks. Nothing crazy or military grade, just high-quality civilian equipment that you can buy from any preparedness supply company. The whole project took almost a year from start to finish and cost me about $60,000 including permits and labor. But when it was done, I had complete peace of mind knowing my family would be safe and comfortable no matter what happened. For the first few months after moving in, everything was perfect. My neighbors were friendly but not nosy, the HOA seemed to stick to basic maintenance issues, and I was really happy with my decision to buy in this community. I even started getting to know a few people on my street. There was a retired nurse who lived 2 houses down, a young couple with twins across the street, and an older gentleman who worked nights and grew amazing tomatoes in his backyard. Then I met our HOA president. His name doesn't matter, but for the sake of this story, let's call him Dave. Dave is probably in his early 60s, drives a luxury SUV that he washes every weekend, and has the kind of perfect lawn that makes you wonder if he measures each blade of grass individually. He retired from some middle management position a few years back and apparently decided that running our HOA would be his new full-time hobby. The first time we interacted was at a community meeting about updating the landscape maintenance contract. Dave ran the meeting like he was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company instead of a guy managing a neighborhood association. He had PowerPoint presentations, printed handouts, and kept referring to a thick binder of rules and procedures that he'd apparently written himself. During the meeting, he made several comments about maintaining property values and keeping the neighborhood attractive to the right kind of families. When someone asked about installing solar panels, Dave went into a 10-minute speech about aesthetic standards and how certain modifications could negatively impact everyone's home values. I didn't say anything at the time, but I definitely got the impression that Dave had very specific ideas about what belonged in our community. After the meeting, Dave introduced himself and asked what I did for work. When I mentioned logistics and emergency planning, his whole demeanor changed. He started asking questions about my house and whether I had any plans for major modifications. I kept my answers vague, but I could tell he was fishing for something specific. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Dave walking past my house more often than seemed normal. He'd slow down when he got to my driveway, sometimes stopping to look at the landscaping or take pictures with his phone. At first I thought maybe he was just being thorough about property maintenance, but it started feeling more like surveillance. The situation escalated about 2 months ago during what Dave called a routine landscaping inspection. I was in my garage working on a project when I heard voices in my backyard. When I went to investigate, I found Dave and 2 other board members standing near my back fence, pointing at the concrete pad and taking notes on clipboards. I walked outside and asked if there was a problem. Dave immediately launched into a speech about how he'd noticed some new construction elements that weren't there when he reviewed my property last year. He pointed to the air intake vents and demanded to know what they were for. When I explained they were part of a ventilation system for a basement workshop, he got visibly upset. Dave said he'd done some research and was concerned that I might be operating some kind of business out of my home without proper permits. He claimed that workshop ventilation systems were typically used for activities that could create noise, odors, or safety hazards that would violate HOA covenants. He demanded to see my permits and threatened to fine me if I couldn't prove everything was properly authorized. I told him I'd be happy to provide documentation, but I wasn't going to discuss my personal property with a group of people standing in my backyard without any advance notice. Dave didn't like that answer. He said that as HOA president, he had the right to investigate any modifications that might affect property values or violate community standards. That's when I realized this guy was going to be a problem. I went inside and printed copies of my permits, building approvals, and inspection certificates. When I came back outside, Dave was crouched down next to one of the air vents, trying to peer inside with a flashlight. I handed him the paperwork and watched his expression change as he realized everything was completely legitimate. But instead of apologizing or acknowledging that he'd overstepped, Dave started asking more detailed questions about what kind of workshop required such extensive ventilation. He wanted to know what equipment I was using, what materials I was storing, and whether any of my activities involved chemicals or processes that could pose environmental risks. I explained that I was building a storm shelter and emergency supply storage area, all completely legal and properly permitted. Dave's face went red. He said that bunkers and survival shelters were not appropriate for a prestigious community like ours, and that my paranoid prepper lifestyle was exactly the kind of thing that would drive away quality families and hurt everyone's property values. The other board members looked uncomfortable, but Dave kept going. He said he was going to research HOA covenants more thoroughly and find a way to stop me from turning our neighborhood into what he called a compound for doomsday fanatics. He gathered up his papers and left, but not before warning me that this conversation wasn't over. I spent that evening reading through every page of our HOA documents. Most of it was standard stuff about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and parking restrictions. But buried deep in the appendix, I found a section about emergency preparedness that had apparently been added several years ago after a major storm damaged several homes in the area. The language was very clear. The HOA not only permitted storm shelters and emergency supply storage, it actually encouraged them as long as they met state safety guidelines and didn't exceed certain height restrictions above ground. There was even a provision stating that emergency preparedness facilities were exempt from normal aesthetic review processes as long as they were primarily underground or concealed. Dave had obviously never read this section, or he'd chosen to ignore it. 2 days later, I got a formal letter from the HOA delivered by certified mail. Dave was demanding that I cease all construction activities and submit to a full property inspection within 72 hours. He claimed I was operating an unpermitted dwelling that violated county building codes and posed potential safety hazards to neighboring properties. The letter also included a notice of violation and a fine schedule. $500 per day until the illegal modifications were removed or properly permitted. Dave had clearly done some research and found examples of HOA enforcement actions from other communities, because the letter was full of legal terminology and references to property management law. What Dave hadn't done was actually read our HOA covenants. I made copies of the relevant sections and drafted a response letter. I kept the tone professional but made it very clear that my storm shelter was not only permitted by the county, but specifically protected by our own HOA documents. I included copies of all my permits and inspection reports, plus a highlighted section of the HOA covenants that explicitly authorized emergency preparedness facilities. I hand-delivered the letter to Dave's house the next morning. His wife answered the door and seemed confused when I explained why I was there. She called for Dave, and when he saw me standing on his porch with an envelope, his whole face changed. He snatched the letter, told me he'd review it with the board, and slammed the door. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I was working in my home office when I heard multiple car doors slamming in my driveway. I looked out the window and saw 2 police cars, a fire department SUV, and a van from the county building department. Dave was standing on my lawn talking to the officers and pointing toward my house. This was about to get interesting. I walked outside and introduced myself to the lead police officer. He seemed professional, but explained that they'd received a complaint about possible illegal construction and unsafe storage of hazardous materials on my property. David told them I was operating some kind of underground facility without proper permits and might be storing chemicals or other dangerous substances. The fire marshal stepped forward and asked if I had any objection to allowing them to inspect the premises. I told them I'd be happy to cooperate, but first I wanted to understand exactly what they'd been told. Dave immediately started talking about how he'd discovered evidence of unpermitted construction and was concerned about public safety. The building inspector interrupted Dave and asked me directly whether I had permits for any recent construction or modifications. I told him I absolutely did, and invited everyone inside to review the documentation. Dave's face fell. He'd clearly been expecting me to refuse the inspection or make excuses about missing permits. Instead, I led the group down to my basement office where I kept all my project files organized in clearly labeled binders. I started with the original architectural plans, then moved through the structural engineering reports, soil analysis, environmental impact studies, and construction permits. Every document was signed, dated, and stamped by the appropriate county departments. The fire marshal was particularly impressed with the ventilation system specifications and emergency egress plans. When we got to the actual storm shelter, the building inspector started taking detailed notes. The concrete work exceeded current building standards, the electrical systems were installed by licensed contractors, and the ventilation system included backup power and air filtration that went well beyond minimum requirements. The fire marshal asked about my emergency supplies, so I showed him the organized storage areas with clearly labeled containers for water, food, medical supplies, and communications equipment. Everything was stored according to manufacturer guidelines with proper temperature and humidity controls. Then he asked about the permits for the shelter classification. I pulled out the final binder and handed him a document I'd been saving for exactly this moment. The county had classified my facility as an emergency relocation point under state disaster preparedness guidelines. That designation came with special tax exemptions, immunity from certain HOA restrictions, and priority access to emergency services during natural disasters. The fire marshal studied the document for several minutes, then showed it to the building inspector. They had a quiet conversation that I couldn't hear, but both of them kept looking at Dave with expressions that suggested he wasn't going to like what came next. The lead police officer asked if there were any other areas they needed to inspect. I offered to show them the backup generator and utility connections, but the building inspector said they'd seen enough to confirm that everything was properly permitted and constructed. As we walked back upstairs, the fire marshal commented that it was refreshing to see someone who took emergency preparedness seriously and did everything by the book. He said most people either didn't bother with proper permits or cut corners on safety systems. When we got back outside, Dave was pacing in my driveway, clearly frustrated that his plan wasn't working out the way he'd expected. The building inspector approached him and asked about the complaint he'd filed. Dave started repeating his claims about unpermitted construction and safety hazards. The fire marshal interrupted him. He explained that not only was my facility completely legal, but it actually exceeded safety standards for residential emergency shelters. He said the complaint appeared to be based on incomplete information and suggested that Dave should have consulted with the HOA board before involving county authorities. Dave's face was getting redder by the minute. He insisted that regardless of permits, my bunker violated the aesthetic standards of our community and was inappropriate for a residential neighborhood. He demanded to know why the county would allow someone to build what he called a survivalist compound in a family-friendly area. The building inspector calmly explained that emergency preparedness facilities were encouraged by both state and county planning departments, especially in areas prone to severe weather. He said my facility was actually a model example of how private citizens could contribute to community disaster resilience. Then the fire marshal noticed something. While we'd been talking, his attention had been drawn to Dave's backyard. He asked Dave about the large outdoor kitchen area visible behind his house. From where we were standing, you could see an elaborate setup with built-in grills, a pizza oven, and what looked like a full outdoor bar. Dave immediately started bragging about his custom entertainment area. He'd designed it himself and had it built by a contractor friend who gave him a great deal. The fire marshal asked some technical questions about the gas lines and ventilation systems. Dave's answers got increasingly vague. The building inspector walked over to get a better look at the outdoor kitchen. After a few minutes of examining the setup, he came back with a concerned expression. He asked Dave if he had permits for the gas installation and electrical work. Dave's confident demeanor suddenly evaporated. He stammered something about how his contractor had handled all the permitting, but he couldn't produce any documentation. The fire marshal explained that outdoor cooking facilities above certain sizes required specific permits and safety inspections, especially when they involved permanent gas lines. What happened next was beautiful to watch. The building inspector asked Dave if he'd mind allowing a quick inspection of his outdoor kitchen while they were already on site. Dave tried to object, saying it wasn't relevant to the complaint he'd filed about my property, but the fire marshal explained that they'd noticed several potential code violations that needed to be addressed immediately for safety reasons. Dave had no choice but to allow the inspection. 20 minutes later, they emerged from Dave's backyard with a long list of problems. The gas lines hadn't been installed by a licensed contractor. The electrical work didn't meet current codes. The pizza oven was too close to his house and neighboring fences. The whole setup was a massive fire hazard that violated multiple county ordinances. The fire marshal issued Dave an immediate cease and desist order. The outdoor kitchen couldn't be used until everything was brought up to code or completely removed. The building inspector wrote up formal violations that would require expensive remediation work and significant fines. Dave stood in my driveway, speechless, as the county officials explained the steps he'd need to take to resolve the violations. The police officers packed up their equipment and left, but not before apologizing for the unnecessary call. As the fire marshal walked back to his vehicle, he stopped to shake my hand. He said it was obvious that Dave's complaint had been motivated by personal conflict rather than legitimate safety concerns. He thanked me for my cooperation and said my facility was a credit to the community. After everyone left, Dave and I stood alone in my driveway. The silence stretched for what felt like several minutes. Finally, Dave asked how much my lawyer was going to cost him. I told him I didn't have any intention of suing him. What had happened today was embarrassing enough, and I figured he'd learned his lesson. But I also made it clear that any future harassment or attempts to interfere with my property would be handled very differently. Dave walked back to his house without saying another word. The story should have ended there, but Dave apparently hadn't learned as much as I'd hoped. 2 weeks later, I got a call from my neighbor across the street. She wanted to know if I'd seen the post Dave had made in our neighborhood's private Facebook group. Apparently, Dave had written a long rant about how the county inspection process was flawed and how dangerous preppers were being allowed to build compounds that threatened property values. He'd also included several photos of my house and specifically mentioned my address. The post was full of inflammatory language about survivalist extremists and suggested that other neighbors should be concerned about the kind of people moving into our community. I screenshot the entire post before Dave could delete it, then reported it to Facebook for harassment and doxing. The post was removed within a few hours, but the damage was already done. Several neighbors had commented with concerns about safety and property values. I decided it was time to be more proactive. I scheduled appointments to meet individually with every member of the HOA board. I brought copies of all my permits and documentation, plus photos of the completed facility showing how carefully everything had been concealed and integrated with the existing landscaping. I also brought a folder of information about property values in communities with high levels of emergency preparedness infrastructure. It turns out that disaster-resistant homes and neighborhoods actually command premium prices, especially in areas prone to severe weather. Most importantly, I brought a copy of Dave's Facebook post and documentation of his harassment campaign against me. The board meetings went better than I'd expected. 4 of the 5 board members were reasonable people who were concerned about Dave's behavior and the potential legal liability he was creating for the HOA. They'd already received complaints from other homeowners about Dave's increasingly aggressive enforcement tactics. The 5th board member was Dave's longtime friend and supporter, but even he seemed uncomfortable with the situation. 3 weeks later, the board held an emergency meeting to address what they diplomatically called leadership effectiveness concerns. Dave was informed that his position as president was being terminated due to conduct incompatible with community standards. The vote wasn't even close, 4-1 in favor of removal. But the best part was still coming. 2 days after Dave was removed as president, I got a call from the new interim president. She explained that the board had been reviewing HOA policies and procedures, and they'd realized that our emergency preparedness guidelines were outdated and needed to be completely rewritten. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to serve on a committee to develop new standards that would encourage responsible disaster preparedness while maintaining community aesthetic standards. I accepted immediately. Over the next month, I worked with the board and several interested neighbors to create comprehensive guidelines for emergency preparedness facilities. The new standards explicitly protected properly permitted shelters, generators, and supply storage while providing clear guidelines for keeping everything visually compatible with neighborhood aesthetics. We also added provisions requiring board approval for any complaints about permitted emergency facilities and established penalties for harassment or discrimination based on emergency preparedness activities. The guidelines passed by unanimous vote at the next community meeting. Dave attended the meeting but didn't speak during the discussion. When the vote was called, he was the only abstention. During this same period, Dave was dealing with his own property issues. The county had required him to hire a licensed contractor to assess his entire outdoor kitchen setup. The final report was devastating. Nearly everything had to be torn out and rebuilt from scratch. The total cost of remediation was over $40,000, not including the county fines for operating unpermitted facilities. Dave's insurance wouldn't cover any of it because the work hadn't been properly permitted in the first place. He ended up having to take out a second mortgage on his house to pay for the repairs. But the most satisfying part was watching Dave's reaction when I hosted my first annual neighborhood emergency preparedness workshop last month. I'd invited everyone in the community to tour my facility and learn about practical disaster preparedness. More than 30 families showed up, including several who'd been concerned after reading Dave's Facebook post. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People were impressed with the quality of construction, the attention to safety details, and the practical approach to emergency planning. Several neighbors asked for referrals to my contractors and architects. By the end of the event, I'd been asked to help design similar facilities for 4 other families in the neighborhood. Dave watched the whole thing from his front yard but never came over. The final chapter of this story happened just last week. I was elected to fill the remaining term of Dave's position on the HOA board. The vote wasn't even close. During my first official board meeting, we reviewed several pending agenda items that Dave had been blocking before his removal. One of them was a proposal to establish a community emergency response plan that would coordinate resources during natural disasters. Guess whose facility is now designated as the primary neighborhood emergency coordination center? I celebrated that night by hosting a small dinner party in my bunker for the neighbors who'd supported the Emergency Preparedness Initiative. We ate food from my long-term storage supplies, which, contrary to popular belief about survival food, actually included several gourmet freeze-dried meals that tasted better than most restaurant entrees. As the evening wound down, one of my guests commented that they'd never imagined a bunker could feel so welcoming and normal. That's when I realized I'd accomplished exactly what I'd set out to do from the beginning. I'd built a facility that could keep my family safe during an emergency, while also serving the broader community and maintaining the property values that everyone cared so much about. The best part is watching Dave every morning as I leave for work. He's usually outside working in his yard, but he never makes eye contact anymore. His outdoor kitchen area is still torn up from the county-mandated repairs, and from what I hear through the actual neighborhood communication channels, he's had to delay the reconstruction again due to financing issues. Meanwhile, my facility has been featured in 2 different emergency preparedness magazines as an example of how to build residential disaster infrastructure that enhances rather than detracts from community value. Property values on our street have actually increased over the past 6 months, partly due to the enhanced disaster preparedness profile of the neighborhood. But the real victory isn't about property values or HOA politics or even Dave's comeuppance, although that was certainly satisfying. The real victory is that I now live in a community where people are working together to be prepared for whatever challenges might come our way, instead of pretending that bad things only happen to other people in other places. And if Dave ever wants to join that effort, my door is always open, metaphorically speaking, of course. The actual door is behind a bookshelf and requires a security code, but I think you get the idea. The only thing left to mention is what happened when Dave finally tried to get his outdoor kitchen rebuilt. The contractor he hired insisted on pulling proper permits this time, which required a full engineering survey of his backyard. It turns out Dave's original construction had violated setback requirements, drainage regulations, and several other ordinances that would make rebuilding in the same location impossible without expensive variance applications. His options were to spend another $20,000 on engineering studies and legal fees to apply for variances that might not be approved, or redesign the entire project to fit in a much smaller area closer to his house. Dave chose option 3. He sold his house and moved to a different community. His replacement is a retired firefighter who's already asked me about best practices for residential emergency preparedness. I think this neighborhood is going to work out just fine. The next one is a malicious compliance story. The following is an old story from years ago, but I thought it would be worthy of sharing here. I, now 53 meters, then around 20 meters, used to work for a now-defunct electronics retailer called Circuit City in Southern California. The staff was paid on a commission basis and were pressed daily to sell our extended warranty packages as a way to increase revenue. To explain how the extended warranties work is to explain how the company made most of its income by scamming not only the customers, but also its suppliers. How it worked is thus. When a customer comes in and wishes to purchase a product, they are offered an extended warranty. So if anything happens to the product, they simply bring it back and it would get repaired by an on-site department. If it could not be repaired, it would be replaced. The room for the repair department was a 5 by 5 foot closet with a shelf, and customer service was instructed to carry the product into that room, put it on the shelf, and return 15 minutes later to pick it up, bringing it back to the customer with the unfortunate information that it could not be repaired, but would have to be replaced. The customer would then leave the store with a new product, and the store would send the product back to the manufacturer as defective, never having inspected it in the first place, while at the same time taking a full credit on the product and receiving full credit for it. So the company was able to minimize the cost of labor while simultaneously receiving income from both sides, the supplier and the manufacturer. Now here's where the story begins. I worked as a salesman on the floor in the department that sold the items that could not be clumped together neatly, such as sections for televisions, stereo equipment, kitchen appliances, laundry machines, refrigerators, etc. At the time, this included Walkmen, the precursor to the iPod, which utilized cassette tapes, mini disc players, CD Walkman, and desktop computers and accessories such as monitors, printers, and various other items that attached to computers. This was prior to laptops being ubiquitous, so all these items were bulky and heavy. One day, a guy came in ratty clothing, sweating from head to toe and stinking like he hadn't showered in a week. The other salesmen and women decided he was not worth their time, and I got instructed to help him while security was called to escort him off the premise. I found out he was in the shop to get a replacement Walkman, as while out for a run, the one he had failed. I walked him over to the shelf that had all the portable music devices, and, after listening to what he was looking for, did not direct him to the most expensive product we sold, attempting to upsell him, but providing him with the most affordable option for what he was looking to purchase. He even asked about the extended warranty, and I told him to not bother with it. He paid for the Walkman and left before security could arrive, and I made maybe $2 on the sale. For the next 2 weeks, I got hounded by the other salespeople and managers that I was not pushing the warranties enough, depriving myself of the sales income that comes with it, thus losing money in the process. About 2 weeks later, when I arrived at work, I was told there was a customer who had come in, asked about me, and left, telling them he'd return when I did. After a few minutes of being on the floor, a man, the same one that had been sweaty, arrived in a full suit, expensive at that, flanked by 2 others in business suits asking for me. Turns out he runs multiple private schools and was looking to purchase a few computers for them, without all the extended frills that were unnecessary. Now, the computer sales at the time were the crown jewels on the sales floor, and if a salesman sold one, they were king of the hill of the sales force that week. This guy wanted 10 of them for his students to use, and I was personally requested by him to be the one to make those sales. I walked him through what we had, and the final bill was over $15,000, blowing away the next biggest sale that year by $10,000. When it came time to pay me and hand me the biggest check that store had written that year, the staff decided to hold a ceremony in my honor and asked me to speak to encourage others that there was money to be made. I said only 4 words. "Thank you, I quit," and walked out of the ceremony, got into my car, and drove home, never to go back to that store again. The next one is an entitled people story. Some context. I've been an independent handyman for 10 years and use a gig app for some extra cash, but mainly to steal the company's clients because they're the worst company to exist since they off-rip clients and the independent contractors that work for them. I'm really good at my job and I'm a perfectionist. Most jobs are assembling furniture and mounting items. Story. I arrived at a job to assemble a TV stand that's mounted to the wall. It's a married couple with a toddler son, probably 3 or 4 years old. The father is sitting on the living room couch right in front of where I'm working, scrolling on his phone, and the mother is in the master bathroom blow-drying her hair. I take all of the pieces and hardware out of the box and organize everything to my liking, taking the screws, cam bolts, etc. out of their package and get to work. The little guy stands right in front of me watching me start to assemble things. I'm cool with kids and animals that are curious and don't mind them watching as long as they don't start messing with the pieces and hardware. He watches me for a few minutes and I guess gets bored and starts to walk onto the individual pieces I've laid out, jumping from piece to piece. If you've ever ordered cheap furniture from online, you know the quality is trash. If you've ever ordered breath the wrong way on some pieces, they'll immediately crack or completely break. I'm calm and tell him not to do that because he could break it or hurt himself since some pieces are stacked and can slide out from under him. He gets off of the pieces and I start to work again, and he immediately jumps back onto the boards and starts his "the floor is lava" game back up. I stop again and tell him not to do that for safety reasons. Finally, the dad looks up from his phone, groans, grabs the kid and takes him into the master bedroom and comes back out a few seconds later and continues his doom scrolling. A few minutes later, the little guy comes back out of the bedroom and starts his game. This time, some of the boards start slipping and he sees that as an added bonus of fun and starts trying to make all of the board stacks shift. I nicely explain to him again that they can break or he can get hurt. He ignores me, and a second time I tell him and I'm still ignored. I raise my voice a little so one of the parents can hear me, and I'm more stern and tell him he needs to stop or he's going to break something. Dad again groans and sighs and grabs the little turd and takes him to the couch and starts distracting him with toys, but gets bored very quickly and back to his phone. The little monster is back and makes a new game up that's just him poking me in the face while mumbling sing-songily. Index finger, hard poke, right in my face. I ask him why he's poking me and tell him it's not nice and to stop. I'm really trying hard not to set this kid up to where he gets on one of board, and I slide the board under the top one out, making him face plant because I'm tired of him at this point and his parents are not paying attention. His mom comes out this time and calls home over and he runs off to get away. The father gets up, sighs aggressively, and goes to another room in the apartment, slamming the door behind him. I finally have the structure build in time to mount. A side note, the wall anchors that are included with the furniture are never good quality and are never the correct type of anchors for drywall. They're meant for concrete and other solid structures. I don't have any correct anchors with me. I have to use the cheap, crappy ones they included. I line everything up, making sure it's even using a level, double-check everything, and mark where I need to drill. I make sure I'm able to secure it to a few studs so it has stability. I make a few holes when all of a sudden I feel tiny hands on my back shove me. The little crap is back and he's hell-bent on making this complicated for me. He shoves me a few more times, each time I'm about to start drilling. I told him in a loud, stern voice not to shove me. To his credit, he doesn't shove me again. This time before I'm about to drill, he slaps me in the back of my head. I just say loudly again to not do that. I'm not yelling or shouting, just loud. The mom comes out and starts her gentle parenting before she just offers to give him candy or iced cream. This kid not connects being a little crap with getting delicious treats. He says yes to treats, and as soon as the mom turns her back to get one, he kicks at my pile of hardware. All the screws and cam bolts get mixed up with each other. It's just a pile of mess and chaos, causing me to spend extra time reorganizing. Would you believe this little a-hole smirked at me, so proud of his a-holeness, then runs away giggling. I get the thing mounted, and of course the anchors are crap, so one side isn't pressed against the wall. There's nothing I can do. I have to work with what I'm given to work with, but it's up and it's secure. I finish everything else, the doors are on, and I start packing up. The mom sits on the couch and she tells me it looks crooked. I know I mounted that thing perfectly. I checked before securing it and after, and the level tells me I'm dead center. But I checked again, and it's still perfectly level and center. I show her the level and explain that it's mounted perfectly, and she tells me she doesn't go by what the level said because they can be wrong. She goes by her eyes. I tell her it's physically impossible for a level to be incorrect. She tells me to sit on the couch to see. I amuse her and sit down, and it's still centered perfectly visually. I tell her as much, and she sucks her teeth at me and starts pointing at specific areas where it's not level. She tells me to look at where the outlets are positioned compared to the stand. I don't see anything off, but I measure both ends and the middle of the stand. Each point was at exactly 24 inches of height. She doubles down and tells me to look at the TV and soaker that are also mounted. I see the problem, those are crooked on the wall. I check both with my level, and they are so off that the bubble is all the way to one side of the vial, and I show her. She told me, well, they weren't crooked before you got here. I explain that she's used the TV and soundbar being off, that anything compared to it looks wrong. I asked her if she had a professional mount the TV and soundbar, and she said her brother and husband mounted it. Her husband, the guy who was pissed off that I wasn't there to babysit his demon spawn as well as assemble and mount furniture, did it with her brother. If they're so great at mounting, why even hire me to begin with? They could have done this themselves if they're so good at mounting things. She demand I fix it, and I apologize and tell her that I'm already 40 minutes past the allotted time the company gave me to assemble and mount it, thanks to her goblin child, and she could call Angie to book another person to come out and purposefully mount it incorrectly for no extra cost, but it's definitely not going to be me. Again, I apologize to her and wish her a good night. I've never wanted to slap an entire family before so badly, let alone a toddler, but gentle parenting doesn't work when a kid is playing his parents like a fiddle and they reward him for being a little troll. I got paid $30 to do that job, and I'm not going to get a pay adjustment for the extra time I spent there. The only perk to this job is that if a customer is angry for no reason and asks to speak to a manager/supervisor, you can always tell them they are speaking to the manager since we're independent contractors. Anyway, thank you for watching.